We are a species with amnesia. I don't believe we truly understand who we actually are, or why we're here, or how long we've been here, and what we have done whilst we have been here. And we continue to find sites across the globe that make us question how, what, when, where, why, because they are not part of the history that we are taught. They are part of an alternative history where the human race has existed in many forms, potentially many times, across many tens of thousands of years. You guys are going to hear the story of the Australian Stonehenge tonight, and I think the evidence that you'll hear that was collected by Frederick Slater, who was the president of the Archaeological Society of Australia back in 1939, lends credence to the fact that Australia, like many other major continents and islands across the globe, we're part of this global network that we're now beginning to identify through symbology and megalithic architecture. This is one of the reasons I started doing this podcast, guys. I always wondered whether there was megalithic sites in Australia, and I knew about the Gympie Pyramid, and that was one of the things in the polygonal masonry that is in Gympie. And I've heard about other sites that were potentially bulldozed or still exist. However, no one knows where they are, all up and down the East Coast and into the Northern Territory. This great brown land is the oldest piece of rock on this planet, and its stories and its history have not been fully told. And we need to be open and understanding of the indigenous people of this land and hope that they share their stories with us. And maybe some of these sites can come to light through love and respect and understanding of each other as the human race. This is a really interesting one for me. On one hand, there's a lot of information. On the other hand, there isn't a lot. And on the other hand, there's more information to get. I don't want to ruin the story, so I'm going to just get on with it. I'm going to go back old school a little bit. I'm going to use Waiting for the World to Change as the opening song because it's a little bit pertinent to the story. We destroy things and are scared of things we don't understand. We should not be afraid of the things we don't understand. Maybe they hold the answers that we seek. And we'll end with Bathe in the Sun. Because again, we all need to bathe in the sun and understand we are people of this planet. And if we can truly understand our past, then we'll be better able to understand our present and therefore have more control over our future on this planet. Because we are all of this planet, and we need to wake up and realise that and understand that maybe people before us knew how to take care of and use the energies of this planet better than we do today. Thanks very much, guys. Enjoy this one. More to come with this sort of stuff. I'm deep digging research. Really appreciate your time. Thanks very much. We'll talk soon. Cheers.
What you said is what you got. It's the only information. Oh, depending on the one. While we're waiting on the world to change. We keep waiting on the world to change. It's not that we don't care. We just know that the body ain't ready. We keep waiting on the world.
This is the story of Australia's Stonehenge, as it was told to me, and as I've researched since. However, before we get into the story of Australia's Stonehenge, I would first like to recognise the Indigenous people of the Bundjalung, and the site is on the land of the Arakwal people. I'd also like to recognise all Indigenous people throughout this land who honoured and worshipped this site for potentially countless millennia. I'd also like to recognise the work of Richard Patterson, who I had the pleasure of attending the first Stonehenge talk in 70 years over the weekend, which has inspired this podcast, and also the work of the Strong brothers, Evan and Stephen, for supplying some of the information I'll share with you guys tonight. Some of the guys that have been to this site are the likes of Graham Hancock, Hugh Newman, the Strong brothers, Richard Patterson, and Indigenous who smoked and cleansed the site when it was rediscovered. I want to set the scene for you guys for a second. And imagine Australia as it was before the white man came here. It was a place of savannas and plains and billabongs. Truly was the dream time that we've all heard about. And they have the serpent, which runs from the east coast of Australia all the way to the west. And the site that we are talking about is actually on the easternmost point of Australia. And again, geographical significance of these ancient megalithic sites is always very interesting to behold. And this site, because of the now state of it and the fact that it was bulldozed in 1940 or 45, depending on the information, there's not a lot we can garner from it. However, what can be garnered from it is the work that was done by Frederick Slater, the president of the Archaeology Association of Australia, back in the late 1930s. And that's where we begin our story, because that is the first time we have recorded record of these stone circles existing. There was a teacher in the Byron Bay, Mullumbimby area who was fascinated by the Indigenous people and thought they were much more advanced and much more complex and had a very good understanding of the earth and was very interested by their culture. And in this school, as this teacher shared his interest for Indigenous culture, there was a young boy, a student, who piped up and told him, if you enjoy Indigenous architecture and culture, I have these stone circles on my farm. Would you like to come and have a look at them? And so he did. And what he found blew him away. And he then employed the services of Frederick Slater, who with a team of a few people and some Indigenous people of the time surveyed the entire site. Now this site, when it was still standing, comprised of 184 stones. There's two mounds, both of which exist today. The larger mound is about 100 metres long, and the smaller mound is about 70 metres long and 5 metres high. Both of these mounds are artificial, and what I mean by that is they were created. And there's a lot of geological work that has been done by the Evan brothers that is on Graham Hancock's website for you guys to have a look at. However, these mounds were artificially created. What Frederick Slater found was, as he put it, the birth of all knowledge. The mound is one of the oldest, I should say the oldest forms of temples in the world and dates back to the advent of first man. There's Slater's words from the report. However, before we keep going, how do we have these reports? This information was lost to time, and we owe it to Richard Patterson, who was then a volunteer at the Historical Society there in Mullumbimby. He's a curious man, and I thoroughly enjoyed his talk. And again, that's what has inspired me to talk to you guys tonight, because I need to share his story as he shared it with me. He was looking around and he'd heard of the Australian Stonehenge. I'd heard of it before as well. And he thought to himself, where would I find papers that weren't supposed to be found? So he started digging around in behind filing cabinets and bookcases. And behind one of those bookcases, he found some of the survey documents from Slater himself, dating back to the late 1930s, which then sent him on a mission And in between everything he was doing, he dug through all the files, all the back catalogues, all the old filing cabinets. And what he discovered, or should I say rediscovered, was the survey documents that record all the placements of the stone, the directions, the type of stone, many of the symbols. And when I say symbols, Slater identified up to 28,000 words. These were, and when I say words, I mean early hieroglyphs. And that's actually something that we need to talk about a little bit later. But they were represented in hand signs, letters, sacred signs, and body parts. And they were all over this stone circle. There was also crystals present, and the Bundjalung used crystals. They used them at sacred sites, for ceremonies, at high energy grids and vortices, and Bora rings. Now, a Bora ring, for those that don't know, is very, very similar to the Celtic cross, or the Native American medicine circle. So that's 3 separate continents using the same symbol. Again, we are looking at symbols and symbology and ways to activate energy centers that mirror themselves across continents, across the globe. So Patterson dug into these files and he found what he was looking for. And he also found the property that they're on, which is in the Mullumbimby area. And he approached the farmer there as to whether or not he knew about stone circles on his property. Now, this farmer, who was at this time in 2013, a very old man, served in the war. And this farmer was the same student who told the teacher about the stone circles back in the 30s. And after some communication with the old man and sharing some war stories and gaining his trust, he told Richard that he was the one that bulldozed the stone circles. Now, the reason they were bulldozed, because obviously since I was at Richard's talk, I didn't want to freshly research anything before I went down there because I didn't want to spoil anything he was going to say. However, since then, I've read every article there is to read on the internet in regards to it. And the reason behind them being bulldozed, and actually some further research from another fellow coder, it's come to light that potentially during the 40s after the war, there was a lot of these indigenous sites being discovered, and with the threat of the government taking the land back for archaeological significance, a lot of these farmers bulldozed these sites in order to keep their land. If only they knew what they were doing. However, this soldier was used to taking orders and did as he was told. His father told him to bulldoze the circles, so that's what he did. And Australia's Stonehenge was no more until 2013, when Patterson rediscovered the survey documentation that Slater had recorded way back then. To pretend that this is not a mind-blowingly significant site globally, it pales in comparison to Stonehenge potentially. The problem we have here is that we can't see it. It doesn't exist. However, Richard Patterson and the Strong brothers, and they conducted archaeological digs on that site over the period of a couple of days, and they found many stones that were carved. Sandstone, actually. Now, some of these pillars, from the descriptions of Slater and some of the other readings I've said, are up to 2 metres high, 500 mm in diameter, weighing tonnes. Now, the nearest sandstone deposit from where the site is, depending on the type of sandstone, is 20 to 40 kilometres away. Now, theoretically, at the earliest, this stone circle was built 5,000-10,000 years ago. How did they move the stone? How did they cut the stone? Because it was also said that the larger sandstone blocks were actually 3D relief carvings. One of a crocodile, one of a foot, one that had multiple types of carvings on it. However, this was not carvings that were just dug into the stone with another sharp implement. These were 3D carvings. That represents a level of technology that supposedly did not exist here in Australia at that time. And again, it provides the mystery of how did not only our indigenous people However, all these other civilizations around the globe actually build these megalithic sites, because a lot of them themselves are art, they're out-of-place artifacts. It does not make sense that they are there. However, the symbology behind them echoes around the globe. And as we'll see in the coming time of this podcast, it wasn't only the indigenous people that attended this circle, the evidence suggests. And when I say indigenous people, it seems that all tribes across this great brown land came to this one spot to participate in ritual and song and potentially initiation. And that's very important, that all tribes came together to this one place. That is how sacred it was. As I say, from Slater's survey documentation, 184 stones, 2 mounds, one of 70 metres high by 5 metres, 70 metres long by 5 metres high, and one 100 metres long by 5 metres high. On the southern slope, there was a set of stones that represented the medicine wheel, and Slater translated this to the mystery of life. Guided by truth, man came to earth through darkness, from light of life that shines far off. Now, in many cultures, these sites are astrologically aligned, and Australia's Stonehenge was no different. It mirrored the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, and from where you view this site, according to the pictures that I was shown on the weekend, the hills almost mirror the Great Pyramids of Egypt. And there is more than a little bit of Egyptian influence in this. Now, what Slater did when he translated this, and the fact that it was bulldozed so close after he discovered it, which therefore wiped it from existence, as he said, that there is no mistake that the Aborigines gave not only their knowledge and their foundation of hieroglyphics, their philosophy, but formulated the basis of all knowledge in the beginning, now, and to come. He credited this temple complex, this Stonehenge, as the earliest forms of language, the basis of numbers, philosophy, hieroglyphics, and a lot of the symbols that are recorded, that he recorded on the site, are mirrored in some of the hieroglyphs and some of the early hieroglyphs from the Egyptians. Now, those that are keen megalith hunters and people that look at this knowledge would understand that there is the Gosford hieroglyphs that are in New South Wales as well. You know, they have found all sorts of coins out here after the flood that shouldn't have been here. They've found Roman coins up in the Northern Territory. Now, the Chinese were said to have traded with the indigenous people. There's so much evidence that the people that settled Australia, the English, were not the first ones to visit here and trade with the people. And what some of our international listeners may not understand is that in Australia is the oldest piece of rock that exists on the planet in Western Australia. It is literally billions of years old. We are the oldest landmass that exists on the planet. And some of the evidence it's suggesting, and this is a new one to me, and I don't want to talk too much about it because I want to do some more research, is the out of Australia theory, the fact that potentially there was a people or a race of people that developed out of Australia as opposed to out of Africa, which is a very interesting concept. So current archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous people were here at least 80,000 years ago, and that's just what we've found. Okay, and again, unfortunately, we can't date stone. However, this Stonehenge was a place of initiation, where you went from the dark to the light. And all the stones that were placed along this row that extended for nearly 274 metres, according to Slater's documents, were placed there for a reason. And you started at one stone circle and you moved your way through to the other stone circle. Another quote from Slater: "The basis of all knowledge, all science, all history, and all forms of writing which began in numeration is what he found when he surveyed that site back in 1939. To lend credence to the fact that the Egyptians may have been in the area or may have worshipped at the site, along the Brunswick River there was a stone ship with a curved bow in the Egyptian style, a curved bow in the Egyptian style with 2 anchor stones with holes through them where you would actually attach a ship. There's also a heap of sandstone which would be the ballast out of these ships as they went up the river, because obviously in heavy seas you need to weigh your ship down. However, in a river you need at least amount of boat in the water, so you release some of the ballast, and there is evidence of some of this ballast found along the Brunswick River. Sandstone and other types of stone that shouldn't be there, that actually looks carved. It's 4-sided, 6-sided. It's not just stone. And even now, so fast forward to 2013, when Richard got access to the site and he convinced the owners of the property to allow him to study the site, one of the first things he did, and the honourable things he did, was bring Indigenous people onto the site to do a smoking ceremony. And they did that, and 8 eagles flew overhead. Now, the symbology of the eagle and the bird is very important in Indigenous culture, and having 8 is a magical number. And it's interesting that 8 represents infinity, and 8 is a lucky number, again, across the planet. These things and the ways that we look at things echo through eternity. However, after the 8 birds flew and got the blessing, the interpretation from the local Indigenous people who conducted the smoking ceremony, that this site was open to all people, that the knowledge must be shared and passed on. And again, that's what's driven me to pass it on to you guys tonight. Now, you may think that the fact that potentially Egyptians worshipped at this site is a bit far-fetched, and it is a bit of a leap, considering we don't have the stones to actually look at. I know some of the things they found when they did the archaeological dig were many 4 or 6-sided stone points. I will be putting those up on Instagram tomorrow, the ones that I did find, and they're quite clearly carved. You find no straight lines in nature. This is the remnants of what is there now. I can only imagine what it was like to see it back then. They found the remnants of many stones, and there was also basalt columns as well. And some of the sandstone, or some of the basalt columns seem to have a sandstone layering on the outside of them. Now, back when it was first viewed, maybe these basalt columns were identified as sandstone, as they didn't at the time have time to cut them open. That's just something interesting that I found along the way. However, regardless, there was 184 standing stones in Australia, just outside Mullumbimby. Now, the Indigenous Australians as a global influence is quite an interesting one. I know we've spoken about on the podcast before the fact that in Southern America they have corroborees and they wear the same masks and the same paint as they do in Australia. And quite interestingly, just while I was researching this and putting this together, an article came out that there's a bit of South America in Western Australia that's 1.8 billion years old. So once upon a time, we were all connected. And I think one of the things we need to discuss when we're talking about the age of these potential megaliths and these stone circles, because the thing is we can't date stone. We do not know actually how old they were. What we do know is that the Indigenous people now were custodians of that stone circle and used it in initiation and ritual as far back as they can remember, before the arrival of the white man. Now, we are lost in a window of time at the moment, because how do you grasp the fact that Indigenous people have been on this continent for 80,000 years? Now, I watched an interesting video by Randall Carlson that's on the Facebook page, and he catalogued 25 different, not extinction level events, however, events that would definitely affect us. And he catalogued them over 15,000 years, I think. And that was an eye-opener. What I didn't know is that there was a major tidal wave here in the 1500s. I didn't know that one. However, that's another one by a potential asteroid or meteorite impact between Australia and New Zealand created a tidal wave that brushed up against the mountains. Now, how would have that affected this site, considering it's on the coastline? Was this site built after that? Was it another one of these outposts that we constantly see around the planet because of the survivors of the cataclysm? We've talked a lot about that, about the survivors of the cataclysm that happened 13,000 years ago, that hit the reset button on our civilization. Personally, I think the emergence of and the greater understanding of sites like these, Australia's Stonehenge. There's also a stone circle in Victoria that lines up with the equinox and the winter and summer solstice. There's also whispers of other rock formations up and down the east coast of Australia. And as someone who spent time in Arnhem Land with the Indigenous brothers and sisters who taught me so much. I've went spearfishing and built a spear, and in the traditional way, it was such an honour to spend time out there. Who knows what's out there? However, these guys have been around for longer than we can even understand, and their influence actually echoes across the globe. And to say that the Indigenous people may have been or may have created the first form of language, as Slater professed in his documents done in the late 1930s. And I know that sounds far-fetched. I know that's a bit of a leap. However, is it a bit of a leap because of the known evidence that we have and the fact that we're attached to that known evidence? If we know that the oldest bit of rock exists on this great brown land that I was privileged enough to be born onto, why wouldn't there be multi-generations of people that had an influence around the globe? And the interesting thing, as I say, there is Indigenous art and early petroglyphs. One of the things I was looking at, I was like, what is the evidence that they created the first language? And the work of, as I say, the Strong Boys, Evan and Stephen, this was in their article. An archaeologist named Leslie Maynard. So, early petroglyphs, there is a category called Panaramiti art, okay, characterised by thousands of small petroglyphs that are found on walls all over the globe. And that is the supposed precursor to all language. Now, as a proponent of Australia being the basis of this language, he sent out 7 unlabelled rock art pieces, and 98% of them said they were from Australia when they're actually from North and South America, Africa and Europe. And as the oldest ones are found in Australia, is this not a worldwide style that originated in Australia? That's just one piece of evidence that came to light in the fresh research. This site, it's another one of those things. If this site was still standing today, it would literally change the way we think about our Indigenous people and about our place in the world, and what the history of the true history, not the history that has been written, but the true history of this planet is. How do they have the symbol of the Celtic cross or the medicine wheel, which is found in North America, Europe, Africa and Australia? There was also, some of the stuff that Slater said is that the ancestors brought all their knowledge in the bag. That old handbag again, that's another symbol that echoes across the globe. I think what we're beginning to see, and this is additional evidence to that, is a unified theory of history. There's too many dots that are joining up. Now, this is my perspective, obviously. However, it's a perspective that is shared by many professionals, archaeologists, geologists, anthropologists. The evidence is growing every day that we are a species with amnesia, to quote Graham Hancock, and that we have forgotten more than we'll ever understand. Now, there's a lot, there's two sides to this. There's a lot more to say about this. However, at the same time, the true information, apart from the nitty-gritty that is actually out there that is accessible, that's about it. However, the site or the mound still exist, and some of the stones are still in the dirt around that mound from when they were bulldozed. And I think this, again, it has sparked a fresh interest, because for me, I'm proud to be born in Australia. I'm very Australian. I understand that it's just a bit of land. However, there's something special about this land. You know, I was privileged enough and honoured enough to be adopted into Indigenous tribe in the Northern Territory. I played footy against those boys. I went spearfishing with those boys. You know, I have great respect and love for this land and the people of this land. And I'm of this land. I spent my entire childhood travelling through the bush and exploring the bush. And then my teenage years in Arnhem Land, understanding the bush. And ever since then, I've always had an affinity for this land. And if it is the oldest piece of rock on the planet, which it is, where is our evidence? Again, through the window of time and through people like Richard digging and the students of alternative history like myself and the archaeologists like the Evans, the Strong Boys and Evan and Stephen and others like them. We're not accepting the version of history that we are taught, because the reality is, if you actually look into it, that reality of history is wrong. And unfortunately, because of the way it is, these things are structured, because it's written in a book, it's gospel. We all know one book that's gospel, right? That's the reason that saying exists. However, we must be open to the alternatives and measure and weigh the evidence as it comes in. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate the work of Richard and the fact that he shared his story with me and with 80 odd other people down at Mullumbimby. It's literally the first talk about the Australian Stonehenge in over 70 years. This documentation was lost to history. How is it that, you know, a single person can change history like that? You know, Frederick Slater was the president of the Australian Archaeological Society back in the 1930s. Now, after he came out with this theory that he was talking about, he was lambasted as crazy, and because it was bulldozed not long after, there was no evidence of it. However, he was talented enough to become the president of the Archaeological Society of Australia back in that time. So he was obviously accredited and well qualified for that position, if that's how he got there. So we can't just throw these things out as fake news or any of that sort of stuff. This is proper work done by proper people who are just trying to discover and understand who we are and where we have come from. And I imagine that there's many other sites across Australia that we still don't know about. And to be honest, and I don't blame them, potentially Indigenous people aren't sharing them with us. And considering we bulldoze potentially their most sacred site, why would you? However, there's those of us that, with absolute love and respect, want to see these sites and honour them for what they are, which is potentially the birth of all things. If it's the oldest piece of rock, that means potentially the oldest sites exist on this piece of rock. And the evidence suggests that the Indigenous people of Australia shared their knowledge not only across this great brown land, however across the globe. And there's many symbols that are echoed across the globe that are found here in Australia, as they are found everywhere else. In my mind, I can see at some point there was a global communication system, or maybe a global language. Maybe we all got along. Imagine that for a second. And maybe we shared knowledge and based it on the stars, the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, Orion's Belt, the Milky Way. These mounds are shaped in boomerangs, which have many different is part of a lot of symbology. However, a lot of that's to do with astrological alignment. A lot of that's to do with, you think about the shape of the Milky Way across the sky. That's what it looks like. If we weren't surrounded by light pollution, that is actually what we would see every night. That is what guided the ancestors that came before us. And maybe they understood that the energy of the earth at certain points around the planet is concentrated. And maybe they understood more how to use that energy than we do now. And maybe some of the things that we talk about that are lambasted as woo-woo, because one of the things that was said to us at the talk, and I said tonight, is that there was crystals found attached to some of these pillars along with symbols. And it was said that if you shone light through these crystals, they showed you things that you couldn't understand. They were repositories of knowledge. And that's something else that's been echoed through the history books, is that crystal is hard drives. They are storage of knowledge. Now, obviously, we understand crystal these days to be a little woo-woo and all that sort of stuff. However, the reality is I don't think we understand how they're supposed to be used. And maybe our ancestors understood how to be used. And it's an interesting thing that any time you look at a watch and it says quartz powered, that's a crystal powering your watch. It's also a crystal that gave us the first radio. Would pay to remember that. Whilst I was so excited to learn about the Australian Stonehenge and excited to share it with you, I was also very saddened by its demise. The atrocities that befell the indigenous people, that the people that landed here committed, are unspeakable. And I would like to say arrogance. However, if the government was threatening to take your land because of some stones and you didn't care or know what they were, and look, I don't think there's any way or any part that I would ever do that. However, that's what was done. And some research suggests, like I said, that it wasn't just done in New South Wales, it was done up and down the East Coast. So who knows how many sites were destroyed. I shudder to think. However, I like to believe, and I want to believe, that some of these sites still exist, and we need to honour them, and we need to understand them. Because maybe, like the rest of the sites that are constantly being discovered around the globe, they do hold some knowledge that we don't understand. Because in my mind, the people that came before us understood things that we don't understand. And the things that we don't understand we're afraid of. However, why are we afraid of them? Shouldn't we seek to understand? Maybe it will give us a perspective that we need. Maybe it will give us a deeper understanding of who we are and why we are here. I think that's about it, guys. I really appreciate your time. And again, thank you to the Bundjalung people, and thank you to Richard Patterson, the Evans boys, and the site is on the land of the Arakwal people. So I just want to recognise that. And look, there's probably only about 6 articles about the Australian Stonehenge on the internet. However, it was there, and it represented some knowledge that unfortunately we may never understand fully. Thanks very much, guys. That was really cool. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. Please comment. Don't forget Instagram, Facebook. Like us, follow us, give us a rating, because it's stuff like this that I started this for. Whilst I love exploring my consciousness and improving myself, my other passion is trying to understand the past. Because if we can truly understand the past, we can have a better understanding of the present, and therefore a better understanding of the future. Good on you guys. We'll talk soon. Cheers.
Today I sat in a field of paper daisies. The gentle breeze made the world wave to me. The day has come with a gold ring wrapped around it. I think I might just bathe in the sun. And I hope my world don't crash in over me, just like it did yesterday. I'm pretty sure the last mirror that I cracked was one of 7 years around